Mid-February 1943, Sidi Bou Zid, Tunisia. A captured American M4A1 Sherman tank, its white star hastily painted over with a black cross, rolled to a stop in the desert sand. German officers from Heavy Panzer Battalion 501 circled it like surgeons around an alien patient. The name on its hull read War Daddy 2, serial number USA 3067641, built at Lima Locomotive Works, Ohio. It had survived the chaos of the battle intact. Even more impressive, German reconnaissance troops had just driven it 350 kilometers across open desert to the port of Sfax. 4.5 days of sand, heat, and punishing terrain. The engine never overheated. The transmission never failed. The final drives showed no wear. For German tank crews used to coaxing their machines forward in short, coughing bursts between mechanical failures, it was unsettling to watch this foreign machine simply work. At Sfax, orders arrived from Berlin. The tank was to be shipped north, intact and operational, to the proving ground at Kummersdorf, 25 kilometers south of the capital. There, German engineers would discover why this tank defied their expectations, and, in the process, something uncomfortable about their own designs. By spring 1943, the Sherman stood on the test track under gray Brandenburg skies, its American markings replaced with a fresh Wehrmacht license plate, WH-058941. Technicians had already stenciled every surface with chalk marks. Armor thickness, slope angles, turret traverse speed. Kummersdorf was where Germany dissected both its enemies and itself. Nothing arrived here unless it mattered. The inspection began with what the Germans valued most: precision. Teams from the ordnance and automotive branches stripped panels, measured tolerances, and examined welds. They were expecting crude shortcuts from an industrial giant obsessed with numbers over nuance. What they found instead was an elegance of practicality. The Sherman's transmission drew immediate fascination. German tanks used straight-cut gears, engineered to tight tolerances, but prone to failure if mistreated. The American tank used herringbone-cut gears, each tooth carrying part of the load, distributing stress smoothly across the surface. In Germany, such gears were considered too complex to mass-produce. In America, they were stamped out by the thousands. Then came the drive trials. War Daddy 2 was put through obstacle courses, endurance runs, and torque tests designed to break machines. It refused to cooperate. The Continental R975 radial engine held steady power even under deliberate overheating. The air filters shrugged off desert sand. The cooling system, far simpler than German equivalents, outperformed them anyway. One engineer wrote in his notebook, "The enemy's vehicle performs with no need for expert handling. Ordinary soldiers could manage it. That line landed like a thunderclap." In the Wehrmacht, tank driving was an art form. Gears double-clutched, throttles feathered, transmission temperatures watched like newborns. The idea that an American conscript could simply start, shift, and go was heresy. June 6, 1943. Hillersleben Artillery Range. Reich Minister Albert Speer arrived for a live demonstration. Before him stood 3 machines, a brand-new Panther, a massive Ferdinand tank destroyer, and the captured Sherman. The American tank climbed the test slope easily. Smooth shifts, steady engine note, no hesitation. The Panther followed, straining its 700-horsepower Maybach engine, slipping gears on the incline. The Ferdinand stalled halfway up the hill, smoke rising as crews scrambled to restart it. That night, Speer's aides drafted a brief report for the Armaments Ministry. It was cautiously worded, but the message was unmistakable. This was no primitive machine. The next morning, Das Reich newspaper called the Sherman a praiseworthy product of the North American steel industry. The phrase sounded polite. Inside Germany's engineering circles, it read like an admission. Because behind the propaganda, The data told a different story, one that would haunt every German tank designer who read it. They had built machines of brilliance. The Americans had built machines that refused to break. And by autumn of 1943, that difference would begin reshaping German tank doctrine itself. But first, Kummersdorf would push War Daddy 2 until something, somewhere, finally failed. Spring 1943, Kummersdorf proving ground, south of Berlin. The captured Sherman, War Daddy 2, sat at the start line of a new series of trials. The test order was simple: drive until failure. The results would not be. German engineers were confident. Their philosophy of armored design, precision over practicality, had produced machines like the Tiger and the Panther, both technological marvels, both nightmares to maintain. The Sherman, by contrast, looked almost crude. Thick rivets, simple welds, a radial engine borrowed from aircraft. Surely it would reveal its weakness soon. The first 500 kilometers passed without a single component failure. Then 1,000. Then 2,500. Maintenance teams changed filters, checked oil, logged temperatures. Nothing broke. The engine kept a steady rhythm. The gearbox stayed cool. The final drives ran smooth. The engineers began double-checking their instruments, certain that something must be wrong with their measurements. By the end of the endurance trial, the Sherman had traveled over 2,000 kilometers, 4 times the average distance a Panther could cover before needing major repairs. The statistics were undeniable. German reports from the same period showed Panthers averaging 40% readiness. Some battalions reported less than 25% of their tanks operational at any given time. One field report from Kursk noted that of 184 Panthers deployed, over 100 broke down before reaching the front line. Kummersdorf's technicians began writing their reports more carefully now. Words like primitive disappeared, replaced by functional, replaced by efficient, replaced, finally, by superior reliability. And yet, that reliability wasn't the result of precision. It came from something else entirely. When they stripped the transmission, the Germans expected fine tolerances and tight machining. What they found instead shocked them. The Sherman's gear teeth were not perfectly machined. The tolerances were loose by German standards. The parts fit easily, almost too easily. But that looseness was intentional. It meant dust, grit, or slight misalignment wouldn't jam the system. In a field environment, it was genius. One engineer from the automotive section, Oberingenieur Klaus von Bremer, wrote in disbelief, "This machine is built with forgiveness." In German design, there was no such word. Then came the discovery that made the difference clear. The Sherman's transmission was synchronized. Gears 2 through 5 could be shifted smoothly without double clutching. No need for the elaborate footwork every German tanker learned in training. It was almost civil. One driver joked that the Sherman handled like a touring car. His supervisor didn't laugh. The Panther's transmission, by contrast, was a mechanical landmine. Drivers were ordered not to use third gear unless absolutely necessary, because it tended to disintegrate under torque. Reverse gear was so fragile that pivot turns were forbidden in manuals. To turn on the spot risked snapping the drivetrain entirely. In the Sherman, all of those maneuvers were routine, and that simplicity, multiplied by thousands of vehicles, changed everything. By July, engineers realized this was no one-off fluke. American factories, Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, were all producing identical transmissions, interchangeable down to the bolt. The Germans, despite their reputation for order, couldn't do the same. Every Tiger, every Panther, was slightly different. Parts from one batch didn't fit another without remachining. The truth spread quietly through the armaments ministry. Albert Speer, who had witnessed the Sherman outperform Germany's best in June, now received internal memoranda describing the tank as a model of practical production. That phrase, praktische Production, became taboo in engineering circles. It meant efficiency, not elegance, function, not perfection. And yet, when the next set of tests began, hill climbs, mud runs, stress loads, the American tank still refused to fail. It became a running joke at the proving ground. Mechanics began betting cigarettes on which part would give up first. None ever won. Through the summer of 1943, the test log grew longer, the sense of unease deeper. If this was what American engineers considered ordinary, then Germany's industrial war was already lost. But Kummersdorf's engineers weren't done. They were about to take the experiment further, testing not the tank's power, but the philosophy behind it. A comparison that would pit the Sherman against Germany's pride, the Panther and the Tiger under identical conditions, and what those numbers revealed would shake German engineering to its core. Early autumn 1943, south of Berlin, the morning fog at Kummersdorf was thick enough to dull the shape of the tanks lined up on the proving field. Three silhouettes that represented three philosophies of war. To the left, the 45-ton Panther, Germany's latest creation, its Maybach HL-230 engine coughing smoke even before starting. To the right, a Tiger, 65 tons of engineering obsession, its electric transmission humming faintly. And in the center, smaller, rounder, its armor still marked with American factory stamps, sat the captured Sherman War Daddy 2. The trial order was simple. Same fuel, same distance, same conditions. No excuses. When the engines started, the difference was immediate. The Sherman's radial engine, a 9-cylinder Continental R975, spun to life in seconds. The Panther's starter whined, caught, then stalled. The Tiger needed external batteries just to wake up. After 20 minutes, all three were running. But the mechanics were already exchanging looks. Each tank would run a 100-kilometer loop across the Brandenburg countryside. Sand, mud, and paved road meant to simulate field conditions. The Sherman started first. By kilometer 50, the engineers realized it hadn't stopped once. The Panther had halted 3 times to adjust track tension. The Tiger needed a fuel truck halfway through. The final numbers spoke louder than propaganda ever could. The Sherman consumed 1.1 liters of fuel per kilometer. The Panther, 2.6. The Tiger, 4.3. The Sherman's transmission oil temperature remained below 85 degrees C. The Panthers climbed past 110 degrees C before the first stop. After 100 kilometers, the American tank showed no gear wear at all. The Panther's gearbox had to be partially disassembled for inspection. The German engineers gathered in silence as technicians read the data aloud. Nobody spoke. For years, German engineering had equated complexity with superiority. Now, the evidence on paper said otherwise. When they opened the Sherman's gearbox after the run, the wear patterns were even, smooth, clean. The gears were herringbone cut, distributing stress along both faces. An automotive idea born in Detroit assembly lines, not in military laboratories. One officer remarked, "This is not designed to impress engineers. It is designed to be driven." In the Tiger, they found the opposite. Precision too fine for reality. Each bearing surface required perfect lubrication. Any grit, any misalignment meant failure. The Sherman tolerated abuse. The Tiger demanded reverence. As the trials continued, the Panther's greatest weakness, its final drives, once again betrayed it. After just 120 kilometers, the right drive casing cracked. The crew had barely noticed until the tank began grinding to a halt. The same part in the Sherman had endured over 2,000 kilometers without replacement. The engineers no longer doubted the results. By October, the Kummersdorf reports were circulating quietly within the armaments ministry. One document, stamped Technische Beobachtung Nummer 4444, included a single devastating sentence. The American vehicle demonstrates an endurance that exceeds our current designs by a factor of 4. For the first time, The language of German engineering began to bend. Phrases like operational tolerance, field maintainability, and component interchangeability appeared in official memos, concepts borrowed from American production philosophy. Still, the discovery wasn't something they could publicize. The ministry ordered the engineers to keep findings confidential. Official propaganda continued to praise German technical excellence, but behind closed doors, they knew the truth. America's strength was not perfection. It was persistence. The Sherman's design could be built by the tens of thousands, repaired by mechanics with wrenches instead of factory jigs, driven by farm boys instead of specialists. The Panther, by contrast, required artisans, and in total war, artisans could not keep pace with assembly lines. One of Speer's aides, after reading the Kummersdorf file, wrote in the margin, "Ours are masterpieces. Theirs are tools, but the comparison wasn't finished yet." The next phase of testing would move from the laboratory to the field. Cross-country mobility, live fire endurance, and simulated combat. The Germans wanted to prove that even if the Sherman lasted longer, it couldn't fight better. They would soon learn that reliability wasn't just about moving, it was about surviving. And on those muddy test fields, the myth of German mechanical invincibility was about to crack wide open. November 1943. The proving fields outside Kummersdorf had turned to mud. Autumn rains soaked the Brandenburg earth, transforming test tracks into deep trenches of clay and ice. Perfect conditions for the next round of trials. Live fire endurance and cross-country mobility. The German engineers gathered early, bundled in gray coats, notebooks ready. War Daddy 2 idled at the line beside a new Panther Aus FD and a Tiger from the 503rd Heavy Battalion. Each tank would traverse a 25-kilometer circuit. Mud pits, inclines, river crossings, followed by firing tests under full combat load. This time, no one laughed at the American machine. The engines roared to life. The Panther leapt ahead at first, its Maybach engine throwing mud like shrapnel. The Tiger followed, heavier, deliberate, tearing deep ruts into the soaked ground. Then came the Sherman, lighter, almost graceful, its radial engine humming at a steady 2,200 revolutions per minute. The first hill decided everything. Halfway up the incline, the Panther's right track slipped, throwing a shower of mud. Its transmission whined, gears grinding as the driver fought for traction. The Tiger followed, its weight sinking into the slope until both treads spun freely. Engineers called for the winch trucks. The Sherman climbed the same hill without pause. Its tracks flexed, adjusted, and kept pulling. It reached the crest in a single continuous movement. The logbook from that day survives in the Kummersdorf archives. Underlined in red ink is a single note. The American tank maintains forward momentum where heavier vehicles become immobile. Then came the live fire test. Each tank was to fire its main gun at full rate for 10 minutes, engines running, turret turning, simulating combat stress on the drivetrain and electrical systems. The Panther's 75mm cannon was devastatingly accurate. But after the first few minutes, the turret traverse motor overheated, slowing rotation to half speed. The Tiger's 88mm remained flawless, but its fuel consumption jumped 20% under load, forcing engineers to cut the run short. The Sherman fired 40 rounds through its 75mm gun with no mechanical stoppage. Its stabilizer, a device German engineers had dismissed as a gimmick, kept the gun steady enough for accurate fire even while moving. The test observers wrote simply, "Performance excellent. Fire control unaffected by motion." It wasn't stronger. It wasn't more powerful. It just worked. Every time. Afterward, when the tanks returned to the maintenance sheds, the true story appeared in the details. The Panther's gearbox required partial replacement. The Tiger's final drives showed cracks forming under torque stress. The Sherman? Routine cleaning, oil change, refuel. ready for another run by morning. In the internal report compiled days later, one engineer dared to write what others were already whispering. The difference is not in design, but in philosophy. The Americans engineer for endurance. We engineer for excellence. In war, endurance wins. Those words circulated quietly through the Ordnance Department, reaching even Albert Speer's desk. He made a note beside it. Reliability is a weapon. By December, the comparison data was complete. The Sherman averaged 2,000 kilometers between major maintenance intervals. The Panther, 500. The Tiger, often less. Average operational readiness. Sherman, 80%. Panther, 37. Tiger, 30. The mathematics were brutal, but beyond numbers, something deeper was shifting. German engineers, raised in a culture of precision, were facing the one truth they had never been trained to accept, that over-engineering could become fragility. Late that winter, a Kummersdorf mechanic who had worked on all three tanks summed it up to a visiting colonel. The Sherman is not a masterpiece. It is a tool that never breaks. Ours are masterpieces that never last. The colonel didn't respond. He just watched the American tank idling quietly outside the hangar, steam rising in the cold air, the engine still purring as though it hadn't even noticed the mud and the miles behind it. The tests were done, but their implications weren't. Germany had built the best tanks in theory. The Allies had built the best in reality, and in the next phase of the war, that reality would start killing masterpieces faster than Germany could build them. Winter 1943. Snow fell across the Eastern Front, burying wrecked Panthers and half-frozen Tigers in white silence. For the first time, German units were filing reports that didn't just mention the Sherman, they were asking for them. The first came from Italy. Panzer Grenadier officers from the 26th Panzer Division had seized several intact Shermans during the Allied landings at Salerno. They expected them to be temporary transports, crude substitutes until German repairs caught up. Instead, those tanks kept running, day after day, through cold, mud, and constant artillery shock, without a single mechanical failure. One officer wrote bluntly, "It drives like a truck, not a tank." And that is a compliment. In the Wehrmacht's repair depots, engineers couldn't believe the field reports. A captured Sherman required one mechanic and a few wrenches. A Panther needed an entire maintenance crew with specialized tools and spare parts that often didn't exist. When the Germans began recording time to repair statistics, the difference was humiliating. An average of 8 man-hours to return a Sherman to service, compared to 40 for a Panther. By early 1944, a small number of captured American tanks were being integrated into German mechanized columns, marked with oversized black crosses to avoid friendly fire. The crews called them Beute Shermans, booty Shermans, and treated them with an odd mix of affection and resentment. One driver in Panzerabteilung 214 described it in his diary. "The steering is light, the shifting easy. The motor feels alive. It is an honest machine. No tricks, no demands." Then he added a line that no propaganda officer would have allowed to print. "I would trade 2 Panthers for one of these." The contrast in reliability had become a running joke among frontline mechanics. They would say, "The American tanks fight the war. Ours fight their own engines." And yet, even as engineers at Kummersdorf compiled these field reports, the official line from Berlin remained unchanged. The Panther was the future of German armored warfare. It was powerful, heavily armed, and beautiful in its complexity. The Sherman was dismissed as a mass-produced peasant machine, but the front told a different story. At Kursk, German readiness reports had shown only 16% of Panthers operational after the first day. By December, that figure had climbed, just barely, to 37%. In the same months, Allied intelligence recorded Sherman availability consistently above 80%. By the start of 1944, some U.S. armored divisions were reporting 90% readiness even during active campaigns. The difference meant that when battles began, one army's tanks were there and the others were in the shop. Captured data from Wehrmacht maintenance logs painted the full picture. Average engine life: Sherman diesel variant, 3,000 kilometers. Panther engine, 1,000 at best. Tiger often less. The Panther's infamous third gear was breaking so frequently that manuals warned drivers to skip it entirely. Reverse turns? Forbidden. Too likely to shatter the final drive. Even turning on soft ground was a calculated risk. For the Sherman, there were no such restrictions. It didn't require genius to operate, just fuel and a driver. One post-war interview with an engineer from the Kummersdorf team captured the tone of reluctant respect. The Sherman was not designed for glory. It was designed for survival. And survival, in the end, wins wars. The irony was impossible to ignore. German engineers, whose names filled textbooks, were learning from the machine they once mocked. Some even began proposing Panther redesigns using American-style components. Simplified transmissions, modular sub-assemblies, standardization between factories. None of those changes would come in time, because even as the engineers were testing and writing, those same Shermans were landing again. This time, in Normandy. Thousands of them. And on those beaches, the quiet, unbreakable logic of Kummersdorf's findings would finally meet the battlefield. June 1944. Normandy. The German army had been waiting for the invasion they knew was coming. What they hadn't prepared for was what followed it. The first Shermans rolled off the landing craft at dawn on June 6th. Within 24 hours, over 1,000 were ashore. By the end of the month, 5,000. The German staff maps were redrawn not by breakthroughs or maneuvers, but by machines that simply refused to stop. German field units quickly realized that every Sherman destroyed seemed to be replaced overnight. Panthers burned on hedgerow roads, their transmissions shattered, final drives seized. The Shermans that were hit and recoverable were towed back, patched, refueled, and sent out again the next morning. Engineers studying the wreckage at the IB front found that most of the knocked-out Shermans had not failed mechanically. They had been disabled by gunfire. And that, to the Wehrmacht, was an unfamiliar kind of defeat. A Panther required a train car and a workshop to repair. A Sherman could be fixed with a truck, a wrench, and a crate of parts. American maintenance crews carried standardized spares, identical, transmissions, engines, even bolts, that fit any vehicle from North Africa to France. German crews didn't have that luxury. Every factory's Panther had slight variations. You couldn't swap a gearbox from one to another without machining. It was engineering genius that killed its own army. By July, the German 2nd Panzer Division's readiness logs showed less than 30% of its vehicles operational at any given time. In contrast, American armored battalions in the same sector averaged 85%. The Allies could lose twice as many tanks in a day and still roll forward by dawn. The mathematics were as merciless as the artillery. In one captured report from Panzerlehr Division, a maintenance officer described the situation with bitter humor. "The Americans build tanks like shovels. We build them like watches. And we are trying to dig with watches." German tankers began to notice something else, something that echoed the Kummersdorf findings from a year earlier. The Shermans never overheated, even after hours of continuous movement. Their transmissions shifted easily through mud. Their cooling systems handled Normandy's choking dust. The tanks just ran. Panzer crews, meanwhile, fought their own engines as much as they fought the enemy. One Panther commander near St. Lo described it in his log. "We hear them before we see them, a sound like an aircraft engine, smooth and constant. They move through mud that would trap us, always moving, always coming. By August, German units were desperate for functioning armor. Field commanders quietly ordered mechanics to restore, captured Shermans rather than try to repair their own vehicles. In several regiments, American tanks with black crosses rolled under German crews against their former owners. They weren't symbols of pride, they were admissions of necessity. In Berlin, the Armaments Ministry received a steady flow of reports. The data repeated what Kummersdorf had already proven. The Sherman's operational lifespan exceeded 2,000 kilometers between major repairs, while Panthers rarely achieved half that. One particularly grim statistic reached Albert Speer in September. Average Panther downtime, 14 days. Average Sherman downtime, 36 hours. For an army in retreat, that wasn't a gap. It was a chasm. By autumn, German officers had stopped arguing about whose tank was better. On paper, the Panther's 75 mm high-velocity gun could kill a Sherman at twice the range. In practice, it rarely mattered. The Panther might win a duel, but when its gearbox cracked or its final drive failed, the duel ended. The Sherman simply kept arriving. A post-war report from the German Army Ordnance Office summarized it bluntly. The Americans won the armored war not by superior weaponry, but by the mechanical certainty of their machines. Normandy wasn't just the collapse of German defenses, it was the collapse of German confidence. For the first time, they faced an enemy whose machines fought with the same persistence as their men. And in the weeks that followed, that realization would spread beyond the battlefield, into the heart of German engineering itself, where pride in precision was about to collide with the brutal efficiency of mass production. Autumn 1944. Inside the Kummersdorf archives, reports once filed quietly were now being copied and sent directly to the Armaments Ministry. Each carried the same conclusion. The enemy's tanks lasted longer, ran farther, and required less of everything. Less training, less maintenance, less precision. What began as curiosity had become crisis. Albert Speer read one of those reports in his office in Berlin. It was dated October 12, 1944. The summary was brutally simple. Panther average operational readiness, 43%. Sherman, 82%. In the margin, Speer's own handwriting in pencil. Industrial failure, not tactical. The German Engineering Corps gathered to discuss the problem, and for the first time, their tone wasn't pride. It was exhaustion. Oberingenieur Fritz Naujoks, who had helped design the Tiger's transmission, spoke first. "We built for perfection, not persistence. They built for repair. It wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about a way of thinking." Before the war, American factories had been producing automobiles for millions of civilians. Assembly line production wasn't innovation, it was routine. In 1939 alone, the U.S. produced nearly 3 million cars. Germany, fewer than 300,000. The Volkswagen program that promised a people's car had delivered barely 1,000 before the war began. That meant the American soldier who drove a Sherman often came from a world already comfortable with engines, gears, and oil changes. The German tanker came from a world where cars were luxuries. The Sherman's controls felt familiar to farm hands and factory workers. The Panthers required specialists who were running out of time. Speer's staff examined photographs from the Kummersdorf trials. Gearboxes disassembled, shafts laid out like organs on a table. The Sherman's gears were wide, forgiving, even slightly rough. The Panthers were narrow, polished, exquisite, and fragile. One American transmission could be built in 5 hours on a Detroit line. A German one required 23 hours of careful machining. By now, the engineers understood what that meant. The Americans could lose tanks faster than the Germans could finish repairing one. Numbers were no longer abstractions. They were proof of inevitability. In November, the ministry received a memo from the Waffenamt that bordered on despair. Our designs exceed our means of manufacture. We are fighting a war that our machines cannot sustain. The few surviving members of the Kummersdorf team were sent to analyze more captured Allied vehicles. This time, not just Shermans, but trucks, half-tracks, and jeeps. The results were consistent. Every American vehicle shared the same philosophy. Build it simple, build it strong, and build it by the thousands. One engineer reportedly stood over a disassembled Jeep engine and said almost quietly, "This is genius, not because it is perfect, but because it does not need to be." Even frontline tank crews could sense the shift. Soldiers who had once bragged about the Tiger's 88mm gun were now measuring success in kilometers driven without failure. In the cold of the Ardennes that December, when the counteroffensive began, mechanical endurance mattered more than penetration power. Panthers froze in the snow, engines refusing to start. The Shermans rolled on, heaters working, engines turning, lubricants flowing, and yet the most painful revelation wasn't on the battlefield. It was in the factories. As Allied bombers shredded Germany's industrial heart, replacement parts for Panthers and Tigers were delayed for weeks. Entire production lines stopped for lack of one specific component that had to be hand-machined. The Americans had no such bottlenecks. If a supplier in Chicago failed, another in Cleveland could fill the order overnight. The Reich's engineers had built monuments. The Americans had built systems. Speer wrote later in his memoirs that by the end of 1944, Germany's industrial genius had become its curse. "We believed complexity was strength," he wrote. But complexity was fragility disguised as brilliance. That brilliance, now crumbling under Allied bombs, would face its final test in the spring of 1945, when even the most loyal German officers began admitting that no amount of precision could save a machine that refused to start. February 1945. The war that German engineers had once believed they could calculate was now collapsing faster than they could measure it. Panthers sat abandoned on roadside verges, some with engines removed for scrap, others burned out with intact guns and empty fuel tanks. The final drives that had been redesigned 5 times since Kursk were still failing, sometimes within 100 kilometers of service. Every statistic from Kummersdorf had become reality, now written not in test reports, but in fire and steel across Europe. In contrast, the Sherman, so often mocked for its simplicity, was everywhere, on the frozen roads through the Ardennes, in the forests of the Hurtgen, and soon in the streets of Cologne. Mechanics from American and British units were performing miracles with little more than grease and spare parts. Tanks that had been hit and recovered in the morning were patched, refueled, and fighting again before dusk. German reports from the front grew desperate. One ordnance officer near Trier wrote, "Our armor breaks faster than our men can retreat." He listed operational readiness for his battalion. 4 Panthers running, 16 awaiting repair, 7 stripped for parts. The next line read, "Shermans advancing, all functioning." By March, field reports were so grim that even the propaganda ministry had stopped pretending. Albert Speer's final memos from the Armaments Office told the truth plainly. Panther production must be curtailed. Component supply unsustainable. Transmission life inadequate for continued field operations. It was a bureaucratic way of admitting defeat. In the ruins of Kummersdorf, engineers still tried to salvage something from the wreckage of their doctrine. They compared surviving data, 2,000 kilometers for a Sherman engine, 700 for a Panther, sometimes less for a Tiger. Gearbox service life, Sherman, 1,500 hours, Panther, 500. The numbers no longer shocked anyone. They were confirmation of a lesson learned too late. As the Allies crossed the Rhine, German tank crews began abandoning their machines at the first sign of mechanical trouble. Many had learned that attempting a field repair was pointless. The parts were gone. The supply trucks were gone. The roads were gone. Captured Shermans, on the other hand, kept rolling under German hands. One photo taken outside Leipzig shows an American M4A1 Black Cross still fresh on its hull, towing two broken Panthers through the mud. It became a symbol among German soldiers, a quiet, humiliating symbol of what industrial endurance looked like. When Allied investigators examined German maintenance depots after the surrender, they found row after row of Panthers in perfect condition, except for one thing: transmission failure. Final drives stripped bare. Engines fine, guns fine, mobility dead. The weapons that had terrified the world were undone not by enemy fire, but by mathematics. Speer would later call it the crisis of complexity. In his cell at Nuremberg, he admitted to interrogators that the Reich had lost, not because it built too little, but because it built too beautifully. "We chased elegance," he said. "They chased efficiency." Meanwhile, the Shermans kept moving. In April 1945, when American forces reached the Elbe, some of the same tanks that had landed in North Africa 3 years earlier were still running. The odometers of several recorded over 3,000 kilometers without engine replacement. It wasn't invincibility, it was endurance multiplied by scale. Every factory in America could build one piece of a Sherman, and every piece would fit every other. That philosophy, interchangeability, not intricacy, had beaten the empire of precision. By May, Berlin was burning. Kummersdorf itself was shelled by advancing Soviet troops. Among the ruins, a single American tank part, a transmission casing stamped Lima Locomotive Works, was found lying in the mud. It had survived every test, every season, every doubt, a symbol of a simple truth. The machine that could be built, repaired, and driven by anyone would outlast the one that demanded genius to function. And as the guns fell silent, the engineers who once laughed at the Sherman's simplicity finally understood what Kummersdorf had been trying to tell them all along. Perfection loses wars. Reliability wins them. Summer 1945. The war was over, and what remained of Kummersdorf lay in ashes. The test tracks were cratered by artillery, the hangars looted or burned. Yet among the rubble, Allied intelligence teams were already collecting what the Germans had left behind. Crates of engineering notes, sketches, and thick binders stamped Geheim. They were searching for secrets of weapons. What they found instead were pages of reluctant admiration. One report, handwritten and dated December 1943, stood out. Its title, Erfahrungsbericht über amerikanischer Kampfpanzer M4A1. Report on the American tank M4A1. The first line read, "The enemy's machine exhibits a standard of automotive reliability previously thought unattainable in mass production." The Americans studying the files realized the irony immediately. The Germans had documented in precise language the very reason they had lost. As Allied investigators sifted through the archives, a pattern emerged. Each captured report told the same story. The Sherman's gears, its final drives, its interchangeable components, all praised in the exact language once reserved for German engineering. One page contained a side-by-side comparison. Sherman engine life, 3,000 kilometers. Panther, 1,000. Gearbox service intervals. Sherman, 1,500 hours. Panther, 500. The math hadn't changed, but now the tone had. What had once been a shock was now a eulogy. In Nuremberg, when Speer was questioned about those reports, he did not deny them. "Our tanks were superior only on paper," he said. "In truth, we built machines that could not endure the world we made for them." For Allied engineers, the data from Kummersdorf became more than proof of victory. It was a blueprint for the future. The Sherman's principles, simplicity, modularity, and reliability, would shape post-war tank design on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The British Centurion, The Soviet T-54, even the American M48 Patton, all carried echoes of that lesson. Every component must serve the soldier, not the engineer's ego. Captured German specialists who later worked in Soviet and American programs were stunned to find those same ideas adopted universally. The Soviets had already understood it with the T-34, rugged, forgiving, and easy to build. Now, they saw the Americans had perfected the same principle on an industrial scale. The combination was unstoppable. The old argument, artistry versus practicality, was over. Even in post-war Germany, those who had once dismissed the Sherman began to speak differently. Oberingenieur Karl Weiss, a transmission specialist from Daimler-Benz, gave an interview in 1948. He said quietly, "We built for elegance. They built for soldiers. If we had understood that difference in 1941, the war might have lasted another decade. But the result would have been the same. The Sherman itself became a survivor of history. Thousands remained in service long after 1945, fighting in Korea, in the Middle East, in dozens of wars where they outlived the empire that once studied them. Mechanics who had never heard of Kummersdorf still discovered the same thing those German engineers had found in 1943, a tank that simply refused to die. In Allied museums and motor pools, some of those very tanks still run. Start the engine, and the same radial hum fills the air. The sound that once unsettled German officers in the Tunisian desert, the sound that carried across the proving grounds of Brandenburg. The old Kummersdorf engineers would have recognized it instantly. It wasn't just the noise of machinery. It was the sound of a lesson, because in the end, the war of machines wasn't decided by whose tank could destroy the other. It was decided by which one would still start on a cold morning, after weeks of mud, dust, and exhaustion. And that, more than any battle or breakthrough, was the true legacy of the Sherman. A tank that taught the engineers of the world that genius is not what lasts the longest. Endurances. Spring, 1949. 4 years after the guns fell silent, the proving grounds at Kummersdorf were quiet again. Grass grew through the cracks of the old test track, where War Daddy 2 had once rolled under the eyes of German engineers. Soviet guards patrolled the perimeter now, unaware that beneath their boots lay the birthplace of a revelation. In Detroit, American factories that had once built thousands of Shermans a month were making cars again. On the surface, peace had returned. But inside every modern tank design meeting, whether in Washington, London, or Moscow, the ghost of that captured Sherman was still present. Because the question that haunted the German engineers in 1943 had never really gone away. How do you build a machine that wins a war? Before the Sherman, Germany's answer had been elegance, thick armor, perfect tolerances, impossible precision. America's answer had been practicality, machines that could be built faster than they could be destroyed, repaired quicker than they could break. The Kummersdorf tests had exposed which philosophy survived reality. The lessons lived on. In the 1950s, as the United States rolled out the M48 Patton, its engineers cited field reports from North Africa and Normandy. Accessibility, one note read, is armor of its own. Soviet designers echoed it in the T-54, a tank meant to be repaired in mud, by hands wearing gloves. Even Britain's Centurion carried the same soul: rugged systems, wide tolerances, and room for a mechanic to work. That lineage traced back to a single day in Tunisia, 1943, when a group of German officers watched a captured American tank drive 350 kilometers through the desert without complaint. The machine that wouldn't break had changed how armies thought about perfection. The Sherman's genius wasn't in its gun or its armor. It was in its indifference to failure. It didn't demand perfection from its builders or brilliance from its drivers. It forgave mistakes. and that forgiveness made it unstoppable. Historians would later call it the victory of industrial democracy, a war won not just by factories, but by the idea that ordinary people, given simple, reliable tools, could do extraordinary things. By the 1960s, when NATO analysts compared the longevity of post-war vehicles, the figures told the same story Kummersdorf had written 20 years earlier. Average maintenance downtime for an American tank: 48 hours. For Soviet or German designs, still more than a week. The mathematics of endurance had become universal law. Even today, a few Shermans remain operational in museums and private collections. Turn the key, and the radial engine starts with the same confident growl it had 80 years ago. Its herringbone gears still mesh. Its simple hydraulics still respond. You can almost imagine the German engineers watching again, arms folded, realizing that what they once dismissed as crude had outlasted them all. In every sense, the Sherman became more than a tank. It became a mirror. It showed that war rewards not the cleverest design, but the one that works when everything else fails. It reminded engineers that resilience is not the absence of flaws, but the ability to endure them. When the last surviving Kummersdorf mechanic was interviewed in the 1970s, he was asked what he remembered most. He didn't mention the tests, or the statistics, or even the war. He said, "I remember the sound of the American engine. It never coughed. Not once." The story began in Tunisia, with a tank painted in 2 flags and a question that shook an empire. It ends here, with a simple truth written in steel and oil: perfection rusts, endurance survives. And somewhere, deep beneath the Brandenburg soil, the faint imprint of War Daddy 2's tracks still marks the ground where German engineers first learned that difference.